This is a demo of the Excel histogram feature. Um, I'm going to, well, first we're already on our data tab. If you're not there, you would go to your data tab on your Excel spreadsheet, and then you would select data analysis tools. And the tool we're going to use this time is the histogram. And so now we got to tell it where the data is going to come from, where we want to put the output, and the options that we want. So first of all, the input range, I'm going to select the column price. I want a histogram of prices, and I'm going to include the word price at the top of the range. And so there is the range of my data. And while I'm remembering to do that, I'm going to check labels. That tells it that the first entry in that column, the very top row, is a label. It's the word price. And if I didn't check that when I tried to do the histogram, I'd probably get an error that says you've got non-numeric data in your data range. So we got that all squared away. The second thing, it asked me for a bin range. When you do a histogram, what you do is you tabulate all the numbers between, let's say, $100,000 in price and $200 in price, and that becomes your first bin. And then the second bin is the next interval, and so forth. And you can specify those if you want to, but another option is just to let Excel compute those for you automatically. So we'll take the automatic option to start with, and then later I'll show you how to specify your own. Probably in lots of cases you will want to specify your own. And then you can tell it where to put the histogram. You can make it as a chart on this particular page in your workbook, or you can tell it to create a new worksheet or a new tab, and that's the option we're going to let it select. If you tell it to put it on this page, you have to select a range, and you'd select a big enough area, let's say 10 rows and 10 columns to provide room for it to put the output. And then you need to tell it what you want. If you want the histogram, chart output is the option that you pick. If you want a cumulative plot that shows how many houses total are less than 100,000, and then how many houses total are less than 200,000, and so forth, you can use the cumulative percentage. That's not what we're looking for here. And if you wanted them to be sorted by the most frequently occurring intervals, you could do that. It might tell you the most houses were between $250,000 and $300,000, and that would be your first bar on your Pareto, and then the next most frequently occurring range would be on the second, and so forth. Again, that's not what we're going to be doing here. You can play with that at some time and see what you get when you select those options. So, okay, we select OK, and here's our histogram. And when you're doing data analysis and you keep doing all this stuff over and trying different things, if you don't label your tabs, you're going to forget what's there or forget where you put it. So it's better to put some descriptive label there that lets you know, so you can go back and get it, or when you go back and look at it, you'll know what it is. So there's the histogram, and it's just a graph. So I can do all of the things with it that I can do with any graph. For example, this little label down here, it just stuck in the word bin, and I know that's price, so I need to fix that. And while I've got that selected, I can look at the design menu, and I can change the color of the graph, or I can change the axis, the way they look, and I can do all sorts of the normal things that you can do with an Excel graph. And I can copy and paste that into a report or whatever. But let's look at the interpretation of it. The first bin has a $100,000 there describing it, what that says is that first bin contains or has a count of how many houses sold for 100,000 or less, and there were actually two of those. I think they both sold for 100,000. And then the next interval says this interval contains all of the houses that didn't fall into the first interval. In other words, all the houses that were greater than 100,000, but were less than the cutoff shown here, which is $139,473.70. You see, that's not a very nice cutoff. It just arbitrarily selected that. But there were 6 houses in that interval. And you can go over and look at your histogram, and that first little bar there represents the 2 houses that sold for less than 100,000. The next bar represents the 6 houses that sold for more than 100,000 but less than 139, and so forth. So we got our histogram. It's probably not the one we want to put in a report because we want to use nice even numbers to define our bins. And sometimes you have to experiment several times to get a histogram that looks the way you want it. But let's go back. And what I had already done so that you wouldn't have to watch me type in a bunch of numbers, I've defined my bins over here, and I've put the word price at the top because that's the label that I want to use. And then down through here I have listed, I want the first bar on my histogram to represent houses 100 and less, 100,000 and less, and the next one get all the houses that are above 100,000 but less than 150,000, and so forth. So again, I go to my data tab, I select histogram, and the only thing I'm going to have to change is that I'm going to enter a bin range. And so I enter that bin range, and you notice I included the label for the bin, and that was a good thing to do. And I have to be consistent about that. If I define label, if I check label, that means there was the first entry in the bins was non-numeric, it was a label, and the first entry in the input range was also non-numeric, it was a label. So I have to be consistent in the way I define those ranges. I use the same, I'm going to do another new sheet, and I'm going to do the chart output option, and then I press OK. And here's my new histogram, and before I forget, I want to rename that so that that's a histogram with bin defined, and that way later I'll know that this was the one I want to use. And now you can see, when you look on the extreme left over there, there were 2 houses at 100,000. There were 8 houses that were greater than 100,000 but less than 150, and so forth. And you can see on my axis here, I've got some nice even numbers on my for my axis. And you look at the histogram, and you get some insights that there's a lot of houses grouped down, you know, from the 250 up to say 500,000 range, and that's what we actually kind of noticed when we were looking at the average and standard deviation. And there's a few outliers. In particular, there was one house that sold for $850,000, and it's probably would be interesting to go look at that particular house and see if we could understand what was different about it. If you happen to have a house that came up at $3 or something like that, that would tell you you've got a data entry error. And so looking for outliers on the histogram is always good. And you also look for the general shape of the histogram, the most frequently occurring interval, and so forth. So that pretty much summarizes it for histograms. Later we'll do some things where we look, say, what if you want to look at several different variables at once? Well, you're going to do things like scatter plots to analyze that.